Have you ever had that feeling that something big is going on, but no one's talking about it? What if I told you there are places in the world that don't appear on maps, islands that don't officially exist, but hide the greatest secrets of modern history? If that sounds like a conspiracy theory, maybe that's exactly what they want you to think. By the way, are you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, hit the subscribe button, like it, and comment at the end about what you would do if you were in my shoes. This really helps spread this content they don't want you to see. I'm Catherine, an investigator of cases considered impossible, and what I experienced on that island, well, there's no way to leave the same. 7 people, a missing ship, and a conspiracy that spans generations. In this video, you'll learn the real story behind the Shadow Isles and understand why some truths are meant to be forgotten. But be careful, some memories aren't erased by chance. And the question that will echo until the end is, why me? Why now? I remember exactly the first time I heard about the eclipse. It was a cloudy Sunday, the kind that seems to be laden with omens. I received an urgent call while drinking coffee, a coded call coming directly from the Ocean Monitoring Center. A seemingly ordinary cargo ship had disappeared in the middle of nowhere. But the strangest detail, there was no distress call, just a final transmission, interrupted by a sound that sounded like a mix of static and whispers. When you've been in my business long enough, you learn to recognize when there's more to a case than meets the eye. And then, my instincts kicked in. I've investigated shipwrecks before, dozens of them, some caused by human error, others by natural phenomena. But the eclipse, there was something different about that disappearance. Something bordering on the metaphysical, as if the ship had been swallowed by a purposeful void. A disappearance too clean, too silent. And the most disconcerting part, the official records about the ship were incomplete. Who exactly were the crew? What was the cargo? Why had the manifest been sealed by a confidential order that supposedly no longer existed? I scoured databases, contacted sources at different agencies. Everyone responded with the same rehearsed silence. The more I tried to dig, the more I sensed that someone, or something, wanted to bury the truth. What intrigued me most was the behavior of the location sensors. For some reason, the eclipse's final coordinates fluctuated as if reality itself were trying to hide them. Yes, it sounds absurd. I know, but when you spend years investigating the impossible, you begin to accept that there's much more between the waves than our science is ready to explain. And it was at this point that a curious coincidence crossed my path, or perhaps it wasn't a coincidence at all. An island, one no one should know about. I confess that seeing the island's name for the first time gave me a shiver. Not that there was a name, per se, it was more of a marker. A code lost in a forgotten corner of an old, declassified military map. It was as if it existed, and at the same time didn't. A patch of land bathed in mist, positioned in an area where compasses go haywire and satellites simply fail. Believe me, I saw it with my own eyes, blurry, distorted images, as if something were deliberately protecting that territory. The first thing I learned from this island is that silence can scream. As I approached it for the first time, I noticed the sea was so calm, almost paralyzed, as if waiting for me. No birds in the sky, no sound other than the helicopter engine hesitating to continue. It was as if nature itself was in suspense, tense. When I landed, the sensation was immediate. I was being watched, and it wasn't paranoia. There's a difference between fear and awareness, and there I realized everything. Walking along the coast of that island was like leafing through an ancient book, written in a forgotten language. There were no houses, no signs of modern civilization, just ruins covered in dense vegetation and thick moss. Remains of metal installations, corroded by time, doors locked with security systems that shouldn't have been working, but were. And the power, well, it was coming from somewhere. Buried cables, still pulsed. How could an invisible island maintain a system active for decades? But it was in the heart of that forest, which seemed to grow faster than normal, that I found a rusty sign buried in the ground. On it, something almost faded. Project Umbra 7, restricted entry. It was the first concrete proof that this island wasn't just real. It was protected, hidden, and used. By whom? I still didn't know. But I discovered, little by little, that those who approach this kind of place never leave the same. And what awaited me, just ahead, would change everything I thought I knew about conspiracy, power, and survival. Before becoming who I am today, I was once just an analyst with an uncanny knack for spotting what others overlooked. It was as if patterns leaped out at me, even when they were hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy or lies. But it wasn't until the Mirage case, a mass disappearance in a small town in Iceland, that agencies began to see me differently. I was called stubborn, paranoid, and even obsessed until I was proven right. Since then, I've earned the nickname I proudly carry, the woman who sees the invisible. It turns out that not every gift comes without a price. Being stubborn has cost me relationships, sleepless nights, and my peace of mind. But I've learned that there's a kind of truth that only reveals itself to those who persist, even when everything screams for you to stop. And with Shadow Isles, I knew I had no choice. This wasn't just another case, it was an echo of everything I'd investigated for years: missing organizations, experimental technology, time lapses. And as crazy as it sounds, most of these cases pointed to the same symbol, the same one I would find there, later. When I was tasked with going to the exact spot where the eclipse had disappeared, I didn't hesitate, but make no mistake. It wasn't courage, it was instinct. Something inside me told me this island was the center of everything that had tormented me in previous investigations. The difference now was that I was alone. No official support, no guarantees, just me, my trained mind, and a past that insisted on resurfacing. Because deep down, this island wasn't just the site of the mystery, it was a mirror, and what I would see there would even change the way I saw myself. Sometimes the biggest challenge in an investigation isn't deciphering the external enigmas, it's confronting the internal ones. As I stepped onto that damp, dense island sand, I felt like I wasn't just another case. I was about to discover why, among so many, I was the one chosen for this. And it wouldn't be long before the first clues appeared, in faces, in files, and in behaviors that seemed rehearsed. As if someone already knew I was coming. As if this game had begun long before I arrived. I found them in a clearing, surrounded by dense trees, huddled around a makeshift campfire, dirty, exhausted, but alive. The 7 survivors of the eclipse. Each of them carried something beyond fear in their eyes. It was as if they had seen the kind of thing you can't forget, even if you try. At first contact, no one wanted to talk. They just stared at each other as if complicit in a secret so deep that if revealed, it could condemn them all. And I had already learned, when silence is unanimous, it's because there's something very serious behind it. I started with the basic questions: name, role, what they remembered about the sinking. And that's when I realized the accounts didn't add up. One said the storm came out of nowhere. Another swore there was no storm at all. A third mentioned lights in the sky moments before impact. But what intrigued me most was the makeup of that group. It was incredibly diverse. A retired ex-military man, a renowned marine biologist, a priest nobody knew, a businessman embroiled in financial scandals, a nurse with experience in war zones, a teenage hacker, and a sailor whose record seemed too clean. What were they all doing on the same ship? And more importantly, why did such common cargo require such specific profiles on board? I began to notice patterns. The soldier was a crisis containment specialist. The biologist? She studied cellular mutations in extreme environments. The priest? Well, he quoted Latin texts that aren't part of any traditional gospel. The nurse had expertise in psychotropic control. And the hacker seemed to have access to files that officially shouldn't even exist. Each one, a piece. But pieces of what? It didn't take long for me to understand that this wasn't an accident. Those 7 had been chosen, and what sent chills down my spine was the realization that I wasn't the only one who had arrived there by coincidence. Maybe I was a piece, too. Maybe someone was moving each of us onto that board. And as I began to piece together the stories, the inconsistencies, the averted glances, I realized that among the 7, there was at least one liar. Someone who hadn't sunk. Someone who was there for another reason. And that would lead me to discover something even more dangerous. It was on a night of light rain, while the others were sleeping, that I found the recorder. It was buried under the remains of the cockpit's wood, covered in mud and time. It still worked. I confess my heart raced the moment I heard the first sound. The captain of the Eclipse, his voice firm, reporting normal sailing conditions. But as the minutes passed, his tone changed. He began to speak faster, hesitantly, and the words became jumbled. Sounds on deck, muffled shouts, then silence. Too long to be cut short by a technical error. At the end of the recording, his voice returned, but different. He whispered, "They're coming," he repeated. "They're already here." And then, something that put me on high alert. "The order has deceived us." What did he mean by that? What order? What was the real purpose of this trip? I played the audio dozens of times, trying to capture background sounds, patterns, and there was something, yes, a very low, almost imperceptible frequency that resonated as if it were a hidden code. A frequency that, curiously, was also present in old declassified military transmissions I had studied years ago. I shared the recording with the teenage hacker. She processed the data and gave me an analysis that chilled me. The last part of the audio had been edited, but not by humans. She claimed the modulation pattern was similar to artificial neural networks that, according to her, were only used by top-secret labs working on memory manipulation. Yes, that's right, manipulation. It was starting to make sense why the survivors remembered so little of what happened on that fateful day. Maybe it was never meant to be remembered. And if it weren't for the necklace I found next to the recorder, a pendant with a strange half-faded symbol, I might have dismissed the most absurd hypothesis. But that symbol, I'd seen it before. In top-secret documents from the ancient Ordo, Noctis, a secret organization involved in behavioral engineering and questionable ethical experiments. And all of this pointed to an uncomfortable conclusion: the Eclipse wasn't shot down by accident. It was shot down by someone, and the reason was still buried on that island, waiting to be unearthed by insistent hands. After days of crossing closed trails and skirting areas that seemed to move on their own, I found the first symbol. It was engraved on a blackened rock, as if it had been burned there decades, or days, ago. It was a complex geometric figure, two circles intertwined by lines that resembled astronomical coordinates. But what made me gasp was recognizing it. It was the same symbol seen in documents seized from Ordo, Noctis, whom I investigated years ago in a forced cold case. It couldn't be a coincidence. That island was deeply connected to that organization. Gradually, other symbols began to appear on trees, on the ground, even carved into the remains of rusted metal structures. Each one seemed to tell a part of a forgotten story, as if someone had deliberately left clues, waiting for someone with specific knowledge to find them. And honestly, I couldn't shake the fact that I was exactly that kind of person. It felt too personal, as if someone were narrating a message directly to me through the very geography of the island. I remember one specific day. I was alone when I found a sort of stone altar bearing the same symbol, this time surrounded by carved handprints, small, like those of children. Upon touching it, I felt a sudden vertigo, as if my body refused to be there. It may seem all in my head, but I've learned to respect my physical reactions as part of the investigative process. The body feels what the mind doesn't yet understand. And in that moment, I felt something had been done there, something involving pain, control, and worship. These marks weren't just symbols, they were scars from experiments, encoded memories of a story no one ever told, or worse, that someone made a point of erasing. And the more I deciphered them, the closer I got to a central point on the island, a place where all the clues seemed to converge. But there was one detail that stuck in my mind. Why were symbols of an extinct order still active? Or was it never truly extinct? It was by following a nearly invisible trail, overgrown with vines and thick bushes, that I found the entrance. A metal hatch half buried in the ground, with only superficial rust. It was locked, of course, but the security system still had power, which was frightening enough. I used a handheld device to bypass the code. When it opened with a dry click, the smell of mold and old iron escaped, as if something inside had been waiting to be released for decades. I descended slowly, flashlight pointed ahead, heart pounding on high alert. What I saw down there wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. Cold metal corridors, flickering lights, locked rooms with reinforced windows. It was a facility. Not military, not scientific, something in between. Inside the rooms, I found cells with surgical beds, handcuffs, and marks on the walls that indicated escape attempts. But not animals. Humans. There were records in aging folders, technical files of individuals referred to only by code, subject E12. The notes described extreme psychological testing, sensory deprivation, exposure to experimental sound waves. A mind control laboratory. In one of the rooms, I found an old projector with several tapes labeled Echo P. I played one of them, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. A group of children being exposed to rapid images and high-pitched sounds, with monitors connected to their skulls. Some cried, others laughed. But their eyes were always glazed, as if in a trance. The voice behind the camera said things like, Phase 3, Identity Breakdown. In that moment, I knew this island wasn't just an abandoned research facility, it was a center for large-scale experimentation. And the eclipse survivors, perhaps they weren't the first. I continued exploring and found a room called Field Observation. Inside, old screens still showed images of the island's surface. Some were off, others frozen in frames of people walking, people who weren't part of the group of 7. Who were they? And why were they being monitored? This led me to believe the manipulation game was much larger. What was being tested there wasn't just the human mind. It was behavior, the reaction to fear, hope, disorder, and perhaps we were still being observed. When I returned to the surface, the night breeze seemed to be watching me. I felt like every step I took, every file I touched, was being recorded by someone, somewhere. The feeling of being watched was no longer an intuition, it was a fact. As I reviewed the documents taken from the lab, I noticed that many pages were deliberately torn, but some still had visible stamps. One in particular caught my eye. OPR, Operation Reverse Lookup. Beneath it were logos of pharmaceutical companies, prestigious universities, and even seals of government agencies, from countries that theoretically are enemies of each other. Suddenly, everything began to fall into place. This wasn't an isolated organization, but a network, a transnational conspiracy, operating in the shadows, using the island as a neutral zone for its experiments. Each country, each corporation involved, had its own interests, be it advances in neuroscience, the development of social control, or even the manipulation of entire populations. And there, in that forgotten microcosm, they could test everything. Without laws, without the press, without traces, the eclipse was likely just another disguised logistics transport, a pawn on the board. I managed to decode one of the files with the help of the group's hacker. What we discovered was disturbing. There were records of past projects with names like Vox Dormiens, Operation Lazarus, and Zeta Phenomenon. Each one had real participants, dates, and coordinates. People who had disappeared over the decades, some of whom I'd investigated myself in other cases without ever finding a solution. Discovering they were all connected to the same network was like being punched in the gut. And if all of this was interconnected, how many other locations like that existed around the world? What made me most uneasy was realizing there was no whistleblower, no inside sources, no one repentant. This meant the structure was so well organized that no one within it believed they were doing anything wrong, or worse, they believed they were saving the world. This kind of mentality is the most dangerous. When intentions are good, boundaries disappear, and the more I connected the dots, the more certain I became. This wasn't just a hidden case, it was a plan in motion, and the island was just the surface. Something much bigger was coming. It was in one of the abandoned dormitories, behind a false wall, that I found the leather-bound notebook. It was worn, partially burned around the edges, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but not completely. The name was handwritten on the back cover, Dr. Clara Hens, the group's biologist, the same one who, according to the survivors, mysteriously disappeared the first week after the sinking. No one knew how or why, but in that journal, I found answers no one was prepared to hear, not even me. In the first few pages, Clara recorded common observations, the island's fauna, climate variations, group behavior, but gradually, her writing changed. The sentences became shorter, the terms more subjective. she began to describe recurring dreams, voices whispering, names she didn't recognize, and the constant feeling that something or someone was trying to access her mind. The turning point came when she wrote, "The island thinks, the island observes, the island chose us." It sounded more like a rant than science, but there was a ring of truth that deeply disturbed me. Frequent headaches, sensitivity to light, memory lapses. She reported that the others were also changing, more aggressive, more unstable. One of the survivors had allegedly tried to strangle another in his sleep, with no memory of the act. Clara believed the island emitted frequencies waves that disrupted the human brain. To confirm this, she drew diagrams, tables, and even recorded dates with specific behaviors. Everything coincided with the group's outbursts. In other words, it wasn't paranoia, it was a pattern. What disturbed me most, however, was the last note. Written hastily, the ink nearly smeared. "They're activating the core. We're not the first. We won't be the last. If anyone reads this, don't trust any of us." That sentence reverberated within me like a familiar echo, because days before, I'd felt the same distrust. This wasn't just an experiment, it was a repetition, a cycle. And if Clara was right, then perhaps even my presence on that island had already been predicted. On the third day of my internal expedition around the island, I realized there was something profoundly wrong with the map I'd drawn myself. It wasn't a miscalculation or a misremembering. It was as if the surrounding forest was, and not in the ordinary biological sense, but in the strategic sense. Trails I'd marked with tape disappeared, fallen trees rose again, landmarks moved. It was like walking through a puzzle that reassembled itself while you were still inside it. I tried not to get paranoid. I've investigated cases where isolation and stress cause hallucinations, but in this case, there was proof. Photos taken hours apart showed real differences in the vegetation and paths. The hacker even programmed a drone to fly over the area in a zigzag pattern, and it too got lost. The GPS would crash, the sensors would go haywire. It was as if the space there was malleable, as if the forest had been programmed, and every time someone strayed from the group, it took twice as long to return, if they ever returned at all. I began to suspect that the forest was part of the testing. As if the experiments didn't end inside the laboratories. There was an intelligence behind the island's geography, or perhaps the island itself was an extension of the minds of those responsible. One of the survivors, the priest, even said that the island was purgatory, that we were being judged. But even this theological vision made too much sense to ignore, because the environment reacted to the group's emotions. The more fear, the denser and more confusing the forest became, and that wasn't a metaphor. One afternoon, we followed the same trail 3 times and ended up in 3 different places. One led us to an open field with symbols carved into the ground, aligned with the sun's position. Another led us to a lake with completely black water. In the third, we found traces of a campfire with human bones beside it. But the most bizarre thing was finding a cassette tape in the middle of the woods with my name written on it. That was enough for me to understand that the forest didn't just change. It guided to where exactly I was about to find out. The symbol first appeared engraved on the side of a white stone, hidden beneath twisted roots. It was a serpent with 2 heads, each looking in opposite directions, as if representing total control, past and future, all at once. But it wasn't a crude, tribal design. It was precise, symmetrical, like an official emblem, and I already knew it. In past investigations, I'd found this same symbol linked to the Ordo Noctis, a society that, according to records, had been dismantled in the 60s. But now I had my doubts. The next morning, while helping the ex-military man treat a leg wound, I noticed something strange, a circular scar on the side of his torso, as if it were an old cut or a mark. I asked what it was, and he hesitated. Later, I was confronted by the nurse. Suddenly, almost menacingly, she suggested that some stories should remain buried. I found her tone strange, and it was only when I found the 2 of them talking in whispers that night that I realized the worst. They both had the same tattoo, the symbol of the double-headed serpent, and then everything turned upside down. That island wasn't just a prison or a testing ground. It was a sanctuary, a still active, or perhaps reactivated, operations center. And those marks on the survivors' bodies were not coincidences. They were loyalties. I was in shock for a while, unsure who to trust. Because if 2 of them had the symbol branded into their skin, how many others were connected to the order? And more disturbing, what if they didn't even know it? What if they were products of an old program, now being rekindled by the conditions on the island? I began to rethink the entire group dynamic. The conflicts, the subtle alliances, the calculated silences. Everything made sense in a new light. We weren't just trapped on the island, we were being studied from within. And the symbol was the key. A sign of belonging, but also of vigilance, because the 2-headed serpent doesn't just observe, it commands, and what I didn't yet know was that this emblem, besides representing power, hid the password to something much darker, buried in the heart of the island. It was while analyzing the tapes found in the bunker that I came across a peculiar recording, almost unrecognizable because of its damage. The image was shaky, the noise was saturated, but I could clearly see a group of people gathered around a circle made of black stones. Some of them wore hoods, others wore white, and in the center, a bonfire, or rather what looked like a ritual ignition point. The most intriguing part, among the partially visible faces, were 2 I recognized immediately, 2 of our survivors. I rewound the tape several times. In one of the frames, one of the participants held up a sign with symbols identical to those found in the caves, and in the corner of the recording, a date, 2002. The problem? None of our survivors looked over 4. This led me to consider 2 possibilities. Either the tape had been doctored, or those faces hadn't aged as they should. And then, the inevitable question, what kind of experiment could prolong youth or manipulate time so precisely? Everything indicated that the ritual involved mental access, a kind of collective activation key. But the strangest part was yet to come. During the nighttime exploration, we found traces of the same stone circle shown in the video. It was covered in moss and partially destroyed, as if hastily abandoned. There were melted candles, dried bloodstains, and a metallic object in the center, something that looked like a memory capsule. The group's hacker connected it to the drone's system and managed to extract some data. Some of it was corrupted, but a sequence of commands could still be read. Protocol ZK-13, ritual aborted, external interference confirmed. Whatever had happened in that ritual, it wasn't completed. And the feeling that hung over us was that something was waiting for the right moment to be reactivated, as if the island still breathed that ancient cycle of power, awaiting the ideal group to complete what had been interrupted. And if we were all there at the same time, with specific skills, strange stories, and gaps in our memories, perhaps we were that final piece. But why? Why now? And who, after all, would have interrupted that ritual 2 decades ago? When we finally got a stable radio signal, even if only for a few seconds, we sent our location. The response was almost immediate. A rescue plane was already on its way, coming from a military base on the east coast of Australia. For the first time, the group showed relief. Some even smiled, but I remained suspicious. I've seen operations like this before, and usually, when the response is too quick, it's because someone was already monitoring us. And once again, I was right. Just not in the way I imagined. The aircraft flew over the island, only once, without landing. It circled 3 times, as if trying to find a landing spot, until something happened. A blue flash split the sky, and seconds later, the plane simply fell. It didn't explode. It wasn't hit by a missile, it simply plummeted, as if it had been completely shut down. The sound of the impact echoed for miles. We raced to the shore, but all we found was the fuselage shell, partially sunken. No sign of the pilot. No black box. No plausible explanation. But the most intriguing thing was that the communication device we were using went completely dead immediately after the accident. It was as if the crash had activated some kind of electromagnetic field around the island, or perhaps just revealed one that was already there. The soldier in the group suggested it could be an ancient, perhaps automated protection system. The priest, however, said it was a warning: no one leaves without paying the price. And somehow, they were both right. From that moment on, we knew we wouldn't be rescued by normal means. We were on our own. There was a cruel irony in all of this. The plane had come to save us, and its crash only served to confirm otherwise. The island wouldn't let anyone leave. Or at least, not in the traditional way. And if anyone was watching us, which they certainly were, they allowed this approach only to reaffirm one thing, that control remained theirs. And worse, maybe the accident hadn't been a mistake. Maybe the crash was part of the plan, and the pilot, after all, wasn't who he seemed. It was the sailor who called me over, somewhat awkwardly, saying he'd found something strange on the lower floor of one of the metal warehouses north of the island. Apparently, it was just another locked room, but the smell inside was different. A mix of old dust and ammonia, the flickering light barely illuminated the space. But I soon noticed the walls covered in frames, photos, hundreds of them. Children, some smiling, others in school uniforms, all with handwritten dates, between the 1970s and 1990s. It immediately struck me as wrong. I approached one of the walls and began scanning the faces. Recognizing anyone there would have been practically impossible, until it wasn't. One of the photos, more faded than the others, showed a child with fair hair, a shy expression, and a look that seemed familiar. It took me a few seconds, but then I realized it was the group's manager, still a child. Same crooked smile, same scar on his left eyebrow. When I confronted him later, he froze. He didn't deny it. He simply said, "I thought I dreamed this my whole life." From that point on, the memory room took on a new meaning. It wasn't just an archive of disappearances, it was an inventory, as if each child were part of an experiment, a living data line. Many of those faces disappeared without a trace in society, data sanitized, families convinced they died from false causes. But there was their proof. Proof that the island had been used for decades as a center for collecting and manipulating minds, starting in childhood. And most disturbingly, the timeline of the photos stretched back to the early 2000s. In other words, the project wasn't dead. I began to wonder, how many of us there had been to the island before? Without remembering, what if we were being brought back, not by chance, but by programming? What if this return was the final phase of the project? The moment when the test subjects became agents of their own experiment. From that moment on, I stopped trusting even myself. Because something told me that this room of memories wasn't just about the others. It was also about me. And the next step I took would reveal exactly that. Shortly after discovering the memory room, the group's hacker took me aside. She had intercepted a sequence of noises while scanning the island's frequencies. They seemed like simple interference at first, but there was a pattern. And if there's one thing I've learned from all the investigations I've conducted, it's that a pattern is never an accident. They were Morse code signals, intermittent sequences that repeated with slight variations. She decoded the first few lines and showed them to me silently. The cycle begins again. That chilled me. We spent days analyzing the content. The messages were incomplete, as if fragments had been deliberately scrambled. Some talked about phases, others about behavioral stimuli, and one mentioned names, including my own. This left me feeling lost for a while. How could anyone have known I would be there? Now, the hacker believed those transmissions weren't coming from outside, but from within the island itself, an AI system, an automated station, or something more ancient and intelligent than we cared to admit. The transmission seemed to react to our movements. Whenever we approached certain points on the island, caves, old radio towers, high points, the frequency increased, as if trying to communicate or test us. I remembered a case I investigated years ago, where noises seemed to adapt to the psyche of those involved. It was a form of real-time emotional manipulation. The difference is that there, it was experimental, and here it seemed to be operating with frightening efficiency, as if the island itself were talking to us, but in code. In one of the last decrypted messages, the phrase was clear: Group active, Stage 3, initiated. I looked at the hacker, and she was as white as a sheet. She said this type of message only appears in ongoing operations, which meant that we were part of the experiment at that moment. What if everything we were experiencing, our reactions, our fears, even the conflicts between us, was being recorded, measured? I needed to know who, or what, was behind these transmissions. And the answer wasn't in the antennas, it was in someone among us. Suspiciousness had become routine. But it's one thing to be suspicious. It's another to be certain. And that certainty came one silent night, while the group slept. The hacker, always restless, noticed an abnormal transmission coming from the makeshift tablet we used as a monitoring center. It was an outgoing, encrypted call sent to an unknown network. We began tracking it, and the signal led straight to the soldier, the same one who claimed to be there by accident, a survivor of the shipwreck. Only he didn't go down with the ship. He was already on the island, before the rest of us. Confronting him was a game of chess. First, he denied it. Then, he said he was following orders. Finally, he admitted what we feared most. He was an undercover agent. He wasn't there to rescue anyone. He was monitoring the group, evaluating each member's behavior in response to the island's stimuli. He was part of an Ordo cell. Noctis had never been officially dismantled. But there was something even more troubling. He said that not even the Order had full control over the experiment anymore, that there was a parallel force, older and unpredictable. The revelation divided the group. Some wanted to isolate him, others wanted to hear more, and me, I wanted answers. I asked why I was there. He said my presence wasn't by chance, but neither was it part of the original plan. Someone had included me, someone with access to internal files and intimate knowledge of my past investigations, someone who wanted me to see it all up close. And most frighteningly, according to him, there was a chance another member of the group was also lying, but not out of loyalty, but out of fear. It was at that point that I realized the real threat wasn't the traitor himself, but what he revealed. The idea that not even the controllers had control anymore. That we were all, including the spies, under a greater power, one that used even the manipulators themselves as puppets. And that changed everything. Because now, the question was no longer who can we trust. It was what is really watching us, and that mystery would soon take shape into something none of us were prepared to face. It was the soldier, still acting as an informal hostage, who revealed the name that would resonate in my mind for days. The Echo experiment. According to him, this was the core project of everything we saw on the island, the guiding principle behind the disappearances, the tests, the recordings, and even the marks on the survivors' bodies. Echo, because the premise was simple yet disturbing. Echoing extreme stimuli into the human mind until identity fragmented, was reprogrammed and ultimately reconstructed. It wasn't just brainwashing, it was the creation of new personalities. In past investigations, I'd come across reports of mental reconditioning experiments. But nothing came close to the scale and depth of Echo. It used environmental, emotional, and technological elements. The goal wasn't just to break the mind, it was to mold it to the needs of a silent elite. Every trauma was a trigger, every memory, an archive. And the tests on the island were nothing more than practical field trials to validate this system. And then it dawned on me, perhaps the survivors themselves were already products of Echo. The nurse, for example, began having nightmares about places she'd never visited. The teenager claimed to hear music no one else heard. The priest, in turn, murmured Latin passages found in the order's internal documents. All of this could be coincidence, or fragments of implanted memories. I began to wonder, what if we were all being activated? What if our actions there were part of an older programming, now reactivated? What had seemed madness became logical. The Echo experiment wasn't being tested, it was run. I discovered a hidden terminal underground, accessed by a code left by Clara, the biologist. There, I read the project's original manifesto, to create the ideal human, strong, obedient, moldable, someone who can forget, remember, and act as needed. The island was the final stage, and somehow, I had been taken there to conclude or confirm the results. But there was something that not even the Echo's creators had anticipated, the human factor. And that was precisely what would make everything even more unpredictable from now on. It all started with a scent. Something in the air of that forest triggered a memory I swore I didn't have. A white room, a lamp hanging from the ceiling, and a French lullaby I'd never learned but could sing along to. I froze. The song seemed to repeat itself inside my head like a distant echo. It didn't make sense until it started to. Flashbacks. Fragmented visions, a hallway with mirrored walls, voices saying my name with clinical intonation, and most shocking me, sitting at a table, holding the same symbol I was investigating now. I began to write everything down. I didn't want to miss a single detail, no matter how strange it seemed. In one of the visions, I saw a woman, she looked like my mother, handing something to a man in a black suit. They exchanged words in hushed tones, but the final sentence shattered me. She is strong. She can endure. It tore me apart. Everything I'd experienced, all the investigations, my obsession with patterns, my ability to connect what no one sees, what if it was all what if my entire career was a path guided by planted memories? What if Echo began with me? The penny dropped when I found a document hidden in a false compartment in the facility. It was a Project Echo participant form. Subject F. Sev. Sex. Female. Age at admission 9. Coded name K13. Beside it, an old photo. Me. At 9 years old. The world spun. This was real. It wasn't paranoia. I had been part of the experiment since I was a child. I hadn't been sent to the island by mistake. I had been called back. The difference was that now, unlike before, I was conscious. And that changed everything. From that moment on, I began to see everything in a new light. The survivors, the island, the experiment, everything connected to my own story. Each clue was also a piece of me. And if it was true that my mind had been shaped, that meant it could also be reprogrammed. But instead of running away from it, I decided to face it. Because if I had been trained to be part of an experiment, now I was the experiment that escaped the script. And I still had no idea what this would bring about in the coming hours. It was subtle, at first. A humming in the ground, as if the earth were vibrating beneath our feet. Vegetation began to dry in circular patterns. Small tremors appeared, out of nowhere, always accompanied by glitches in the facility's internal lights. It felt like the island was collapsing. Not a common geological collapse, but something systemic, as if software were crashing, as if the island's own code were disintegrating. And that's when I realized the Echo experiment's activation had reached its end, or its limit. The survivors began to experience increasingly intense seizures. The priest screamed as if speaking in tongues. The nurse wept uncontrollably. The businessman tried to hang himself. And I felt something different. A kind of clarity, as if the system no longer controlled me, as if I had escaped the net. And precisely because of that, I could see what no one else could. The island's glitches were flaws in the program. Glitches, parts of the experiment, that were falling apart now that their purpose had been fulfilled. But what was that purpose? The hacker called me in a hurry. She had accessed a final transmission, one that, according to her, could only be sent when the terminal phase was reached. The message read, "Protocol termination in progress. All data has been collected. Reboot in 72 hours. I looked at her and asked, "Reboot of what? The island? The group? All of us?" She couldn't answer. But the most frightening thing was noticing that some of the vegetation was already returning to its original state, as if the environment itself was formatting the reality around us. I began to understand that we weren't just in an experiment. We were the experiment. And now, with everything collapsing, there would be no judgment. There would be no salvation. There would only be a restart, as if everything we'd ever experienced was about to be erased. Memories, bodies, files, everything. And at that very point, I realized I needed to leave a record, one that couldn't be erased. And that's why I grabbed my recorder. The same one I'm using now, to tell everything. Because even if this island is erased, someone out there needs to hear what I'm about to reveal. If you're listening to this now, it's because somehow, my plan worked. I managed to send the audio before the communication system shut down completely. I'm sitting in one of the observation towers, recorder in hand, the sky opening up in a strange light. I don't know if it's dawn or something beyond our eyes' reach. But I know I'm lucid. For the first time in days, maybe years, and that's why I need to state this. Everything you heard here is real. The island exists. The experiment exists. And they are still among us. I can't say I'll make it out of here alive. The sirens have already started. That message about the reboot in 72 hours? It was real, and it's happening now. The vegetation has stopped moving. The facilities are being deactivated one by one, and the those who are left can no longer tell the difference between real and implanted memories. And you know what? Maybe I don't know either, but it doesn't matter, because what matters is that now you know, you who are listening, reading, or watching this. Now, the truth is no longer just me. You might be wondering, why tell all this? Because while investigating this island, I realized that the real trap wasn't mind manipulation, it was silence. The fear of appearing crazy, the constant doubt, the isolation. That's how they win. But as long as there's someone willing to listen, to question, to investigate, beyond the obvious, Ordo Noctis will never have absolute power. They need darkness to operate. And what I'm doing here now is shining a light. Even if it's the last. If you ever receive a strange call, a whisper, a hidden coordinate, or simply feel like something doesn't fit, follow, observe, trust the patterns. And remember what I said, the truth always leaves traces, sometimes in stones, sometimes in symbols, and sometimes in people. Like me, like you, Catherine, hanging up. Or not, because certain truths, once exposed, continue to echo even in silence. Now that you know the story behind Shadow Isles, stop and think. How many things in your life could be being controlled without you realizing it? How many decisions do you make based on patterns you don't even know exist? What if the biggest prison doesn't have bars, but codes, habits, and silences? Perhaps the greatest experiment is happening every day, inside your mind. Will you continue to accept everything as it is? Or will you start observing the signs, the patterns, the anomalies that emerge in your daily life? Because one thing I can guarantee you, those who learn to see what others ignore will never again live on autopilot. If this story made you think, comment below, do you think you could escape the Shadow Isles? And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Click the button, turn on notifications, because there's much more investigation coming. The game is just beginning, and maybe the next story has already begun around you.